Evening to folks joining us from India and Asia, and a good afternoon to James in London and folks joining us from Europe. Thank you so much. This is, of course, our eighth episode of USISPF's Indo-Pacific Security Dialogues. These are a monthly panel discussion where, with experts from the world of think tanks, journalists, academics, former government officials now wearing a private sector hat. But of course, one thing to discuss all things Indo-Pacific. And this is a very timely webinar because we had the foreign ministers of Japan, Australia, and India who were hosted by the United States Secretary of State, Secretary Rubio in Washington, D.C. on July 1st to mark the 10th Quad Foreign Ministers meeting. The gathering of the four Foreign Ministers meeting built on sort of the previous meeting they had on January 21, which incidentally was Secretary Rubio's first engagement in office immediately after President Donald Trump's second inauguration, apparently within an hour of him becoming Secretary of State. So it kind of adds precedence to the importance of the Indo-Pacific. And the current July 1 dialogue, we believe, is also going to lay the groundwork for the Quad leaders meeting coming up in India this year, sometime in November when we have a date confirmed. And what we got out of the meeting was the ministers reaffirmed their commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific, rules-based international orders, key initiatives around critical minerals, strengthening maritime and transnational security, and of course, critical and emerging technology cooperation. But to unpack all of that, I am joined by three very different experts, but all with an Indo-Pacific expertise. Ambassador Bob Blake, here in Washington, D.C., Senior Managing Director at McLarty. James Crabtree, Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Affairs, joining us from London. And Shihoko Goto, Senior Fellow, Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. I've kept their bios brief because they have a lot out there and for brevity of time, and you all know about their work as well. I'm Akshobh from USISPF, and just some housekeeping rules. These conversations are on record and will be available later on our YouTube platform. So if you think you missed something, you can go visit the Pearls of Expertise sometime else. So I'm going to get started, and please feel free to keep your questions coming in, and we'll make sure we get to as many as we can in the very limited time frame that we have here. Ambassador Blake, thank you again. And, I just wanted to kind of get started with another conversation that, James knows very well, the Shangri-La dialogue that concluded. And Secretary Hegseth's speech, touched on, why Indo-Pacific is still a priority. And he says the U.S. is proud to be in the Indo-Pacific and we are to stay. But with so many competing priorities, the war in Ukraine reaches third year. We saw the recent conflagration between Israel and Iran in the Middle East. Can the U.S. afford to take its eye off the Indo-Pacific, or is it stretched too thin?
Well, first of all, thank you, Akshobh, for having me to join this great panel. It's great to be with my friends, Jim and Shihoko. And as you say, it's a very timely discussion. So, to answer your question, given the lower priority that the Trump administration has given to its alliances around the world and to its traditional partners, I've been pleasantly surprised to see that at least at Secretary Rubio's level, he has made Quad engagement a priority. As you say, that was the very first thing out of the blocks that he did after he was appointed. But I have to say, it remains to be seen whether the Trump administration will accord the same level of priority that the Biden administration did. As you know, Biden elevated the level of U.S. engagement to the summit level, but he also widened the scope of Quad engagement to include cooperation on development, on climate, health, technology, all kinds of stuff. And, given the Trump administration's cuts to USAID, to all of our climate programs, and to so many other things, it's safe to predict that the scope of Trump engagement is likely to be a little bit more narrow. That said, I was pleased that the July 1st Foreign Ministers meeting did announce several new initiatives, a Quad critical minerals initiative, which every single one of these countries understands the importance of reducing our reliance on China. Likewise, they're going to be doing more on maritime cooperation, which is, a longstanding priority for the Quad. Work on logistics, as well as ports. Now, again, I want to issue a little bit of a word of caution. Marco Rubio is still dual-hatted as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. As you mentioned, Akshobh, there's still the continued pull of the situation in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine. And China, of course, has every interest in continuing to support Russia in Ukraine so that the United States doesn't focus more on the Indo-Pacific. And then, of course, there are Trump's continued trade preoccupations around the world. So the real question is how much time and sustained high-level energy the Trump administration is really going to give the Quad. But I think, for India and Japan and Australia, all of them are going to hope for that sustained high-level engagement because it will serve as a useful reminder of the importance of nurturing our alliances and our partnerships and not sacrificing those for transactional diplomacy.
Yeah, thanks again, Ambassador Blake. And we're speaking about your time in the Indo-Pacific, and I want to kind of segue to James, because you were in Singapore for many years, and you followed Trump 1.0 very closely from Singapore. Things have always changed from then. A lot has changed in the world, but some things remain the same. President Trump was very acerbic about trade and tariffs in his first administration, and he's brought that, it's reached crescendo almost right now, as we've seen tariffs form a key instrument of his foreign policy. It's almost like when in doubt, impose tariffs. The main outcome from the 10th Quad Foreign Ministers meeting was this agreement to strengthen and diversify supply for critical minerals. And I'm just looking at the joint statement. We see critical minerals sort of get the same precedence the way we speak about AI and semiconductors. Of course, there's the economic security angle, there's energy security, there's creating resilient supply chains, which were upended because of the Quad pandemic. But would you say right now there's also the defense component that we're seeing, the use of rare earth and copper in defense equipment? And as we speak, a news article came out yesterday about the Pentagon becoming the largest shareholder in rare earth minor MP materials. I mean, it's this just almost unprecedented.
So yes, thank you for having me on, and much appreciate the discussion. I mean, two things to say. Firstly, the big picture. I mean, I agree with Ambassador Blake that there's a big debate going on at the moment about the US posture towards Asia. You can find examples of continuity. I think Secretary Hegseth's speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue and his preceding visit are part of that. Other examples as well. There was a leaked memo that was written about in the Washington Post, which talked about, the sort of military focused on Asia to the exclusion of Europe. And certainly since I'm talking to you in London, the Europeans really see that the pivot is actually happening, an America that is withdrawing attention from Europe in order to focus on Asia. Now that's happening in fits and starts, but it is happening. Then you have a different theme within the Trump administration, the more isolationist sort of focus, which many think is the president's instinct and the vice president's. And so there's a really lively debate going on that wasn't there before about exactly how US policy in Asia should move forward, both an internal and external debate. I mean, in terms of critical minerals, I think the thing to say about this is that it's been an enormous wake-up call in the last month because of the way that the Chinese responded to the US latest round of tariffs, which is we've been talking about critical minerals for a long time and the fact that it was a strategic vulnerability, and nothing ever really seemed to happen. And my sense is that non-experts had decided that mentally this was one of these risks that people talked about that wasn't really something you had to worry about very much. But that was largely because the Chinese had never actually done it before. And then they actually did, as in, facing US tariff threats, they decided they needed to bring out one of their big bazookas and actually shut off the critical minerals. And then everybody realized that they were in enormous trouble. And I think it made the US administration look rather foolish because, in a sense, you had to come back to, when the Chinese did this, then the negotiations became about mutual de-escalation. And it became perfectly clear that the US couldn't manage without Chinese rare earths. It was a real strategic vulnerability, hence why you've seen these panic actions like the Pentagon investing in this US-based critical minerals organization. Now, what does that mean for the Quad? Well, I think it means that the Quad has been talking about critical minerals as a vulnerability for a long time, but it hasn't really done anything because doing anything is quite difficult. To get the Japanese and the Americans to fund the Australians to build a lithium mine with the Indians involved somehow. I mean, this is really hard to do, and it requires somebody to come and beat everyone around the head to get it moving. And the Americans don't want to play that role anymore. You could have imagined them doing it under Biden, but now in a sense, this is America first. And so the US isn't really willing to play this kind of nurturing minilateral role. So I think I was talking to someone from India yesterday who said that China's actions on critical minerals have been an enormous wake-up call for Indian industry as well. But I'm still somewhat skeptical as to whether or not there will be meaningful action on this at the Quad level. To collective action are quite high, and I suspect most countries are going to try and deal with their critical mineral vulnerabilities at the bilateral level as opposed to at the minilateral level. But certainly, I think if there were going to be action at the Quad level, then China's actions over the last month or two will have given a very substantial spur. And I think you'll see more initiatives to try and act on this in the coming period. Back to you.
No, thanks, James. And I'll get your perspective on India in a second. And as you speak about America first isolationism, Shihoko, that's very well evinced since the April 2 tariff announcement, and we've seen the July 9 deadline that's come in as President Trump has sent letters to various world leaders on the tariff rate. I'm sure you followed that very closely, given the letter that he sent to Prime Minister Ishiba, and I think the rate's 25%. And he said in his letter, and I quote, "These tariffs are necessary to correct the many years of Japan tariff and non-tariff policies and trade barriers causing these unsustainable trade deficits." And he says these deficits are a major threat to our economy and indeed our national security. So alluding to what James said, very America first thing. This hasn't gone down well in Tokyo. Several business and trade bodies in Japan, such as the Kaidan-ren, have spoken about this as well. Given Japan is such a long-term ally, a security ally, how does this impact the economic and commercial partnership between Japan and the US, both within the Quad and also bilaterally that they share?
Yeah, so if we step back from all of this trade negotiations, we have to bear in mind that nearly a dozen countries have so far received letters demanding reciprocal tariffs by the White House. And if we look solely at the Indo-Pacific, Japan, Korea, as well as Malaysia have been pushed for 25% reciprocal tariff rates. But we should also bear in mind that it's not just reciprocal tariffs. What the White House is pushing for as well is under Section 232, tariffs on autos to the tune of 25% and 50% tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper as well. And so these are very disruptive, not just to the Japanese economy, but to the global economy writ large. And so Japan is not alone. But it began very seriously to negotiate with the United States to get the White House to back down, especially on the reciprocal tariffs, given how you've described it, its special interdependent economic relationship that it has with the United States. Japan, of all the imports that Japan has, 13% actually comes from the United States. It's second only to China. Japan is the biggest provider of foreign direct investment into the United States, and it's also the single biggest government holder of US treasuries as well. And so this led to the expectation on the part of Tokyo that it would be able to negotiate to not have any reciprocal tariffs at all, and also be exempt from the 25% card tariffs as well. To that effect, Japan's trade negotiator, Ryosei Akazawa, actually met with his counterparts from Washington for a total of 7 rounds of talks. And so what did that actually lead to? Nothing, right? So there's great disappointment in Japan. There was also consideration too on the part of Japan that given that Japan is about to enter an election, there is going to be an upper house election on July 20th, that the United States would take that into account and meet Japan halfway. That's not been the case, and we've seen Japanese voters being very frustrated over what they see as effectively a US betrayal. And so the upcoming election for the Japanese, it's going to be very, very hard for the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. But when we look to the new deadline in August, and Japan is negotiating furiously, as are all the other countries, for the new deadline, the definition of how this is going to be a victory will probably be, I would say, that if Japan is able to come up with a trade framework that comes up with vague ideas, perhaps throw in a bone about concessions on automobiles and the like, but it would be more broad in saying that the two sides will eventually talk and come to a consensus following the model that the United States was able to come with the UK. That could be seen as a success for both the United States and Japan. But we have to look at the longer term concerns that Japan and indeed other Indo-Pacific countries have about their growth and resilience strategies. From Japan's perspective, one of the big issues is going to be enhancing partnerships with other countries besides the United States. And we've already seen that Japan is working more closely with Korea. It's deepening its ties with Australia even further, building on its success of development of critical minerals from Australia. I'm expecting more action on the part of the IP4, that is to say, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea that we've seen under the NATO framework, but that to be focused much more, to focus equally on collective economic security as we look forward to the Quad coordination cooperation as well.
Thanks, Shihoko. And I remember of those 7 meetings that Minister Akazawa had, one of those involved even wearing a MAGA hat that Donald Trump gave it to him. But that clearly didn't fructify in any of the trade announcements, as you spoke about. Ambassador Blake, Shihoko touched on, the rates imposed for Malaysia, Indonesia. Wearing your ASEAN expertise hat, Secretary Rubio had a whirlwind 36-hour trip to the region. In some ways, he'd be happy to reconnect as Secretary of State with that region, given he was so focused on the Middle East and the war in Ukraine, as well as some of the domestic polarization that's taken place. And as we speak about the Quad securing a free and open Indo-Pacific, this rules-based international order, as these rates get hit on things like Malaysia and Indonesia, we've seen, is ASEAN centrality tested again? Because there's always been this sort of dichotomy between some ASEAN countries that see China as a threat, given the South China Sea and the militarization there, but some other ones that are really dependent on Chinese investments, given it is China's backyard. So with these tariff rates hit, is the US sort of jettisoning its position as the economic and security umbrella in the region?
That's a good question. I do think that the Trump administration remains committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific, and of course is very focused on Chinese threats in the South China Sea and elsewhere. But I have to say, its commitment to the so-called rules-based international order is more in question. Our viewers may remember that Singapore Prime Minister Wong expressed this very concern a few months ago, that the United States was stepping back from its role as a guarantor of the world order. And furthermore, no other country was really prepared to replace it in that role. So at a time of unprecedented challenges to the order, we're really facing the question of who's going to be the policeman. On opening the door to China, my view is that the actions that the administration has taken on reciprocal tariffs have really roiled the entire region, not just ASEAN, by upending global supply chains, by reducing growth prospects, at least for this year, and pursuing a more coercive and less consultative trade approach. And that, coupled with the dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development, the substantial cuts that have been made to all development and climate finance, to scientific research, and the more restrictive student visa policies, all of these have given China an important strategic opportunity to be the predictable, reliable friend and the key market and investor for these countries. And indeed, President Xi made a much publicized trip, you'll recall, in mid-April to several of the ASEAN countries and used these visits to portray Beijing as the region's reliable partner and as the defender of multilateralism and free trade. Now, all of that said, the U.S. remains a hugely important market for all of these countries. For many of them, a very important security partner. And most of them and their publics remain wary of Chinese intentions in the South China Sea and beyond. And then you add to that the very real threat that many of the ASEAN countries are worried about, which is that as the United States tightens Chinese market access to the United States market, the Chinese are going to shift their efforts to export more to ASEAN markets. And so they are very, very worried that that is in turn going to very badly affect their domestic auto and other industries. So all of them are beginning to erect various barriers to protect themselves from that. And then likewise, because of Trump administration pressure, they're also taking pretty important measures to restrict transshipment of Chinese exports through the ASEAN markets to the United States. So I guess bottom line, I would say that I do expect the ASEAN countries mostly to continue to balance their relations with China and the US, despite some of the policies that the administration has taken.
Thanks again, Ambassador. And it'd be interesting to see what really comes out right now after the immediate trip that Secretary Rubio took, as we sort of analyze his meeting with Foreign Minister of China as well. And I'm just curious right now, James. You mentioned about India. One of the things about China that we're reading, one of the reports that even came out on the critical minerals angle, was China holds major reserves of several key minerals. Apparently, one report even said it owns 70% of the global critical mineral supply, including most of the world's graphite, which is crucial for EVs. Now, you covered India for the FT not too long ago, but in this new cycle, it feels a while. And one of your focus areas then was sort of, when Prime Minister Modi sort of came into office, and he sort of rejigged India's manufacturing base, because India sort of went from agrarian to services in the last 3 or 4 decades, skipping the manufacturing component, which China, of course, has written the playbook on. And particularly chips are very crucial for EVs. And we know about lithium and the critical mineral in batteries that are crucial for EVs as well. And as PM Modi announced not too long ago at COP26 in Glasgow about India sort of cutting down and achieving net zero by 2070. So this sort of critical minerals plays a larger part in Prime Minister Modi's development agenda, because there's also a political base back at home that would depend on these kind of announcements, given manufacturing is a very essential part of what PM Modi is trying to do back in India.
I mean, the aspiration to be a manufacturing superpower in India remains strong. The progress towards it is pretty mixed, I would say. I mean, India has a much lower manufacturing share of its economy than any of the Asian countries that have been hit by big tariffs: Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore. So it starts from a low base, and although the reform agenda to increase manufacturing has borne some fruits, it's still a very difficult place to manufacture. On the plus side, India has some geopolitical following wind, as in, if you take the example of a company like Apple, Apple, I think, recognizes that its game in China is up, and therefore over a period of time it needs to try and de-risk its Chinese production. It's extremely difficult to do because the ecosystem in the southern part of China where iPhones are made is very difficult to replicate. But I myself have a phone in my pocket, an Apple iPhone, which was made in India. And the aspiration is to make all of the iPhones that are sold to American consumers, or at least to assemble them in India, if not to make them, because most of the components are still coming from China. So I think it's a work in progress. The challenge for India is that, as is often true with many countries, including here in Europe at the moment, that the security and economic incentives often pull you in quite different directions. So if you look at both manufacturing but also the green transition, then the sensible thing for India to do is to do a lot more with China, as in, get Chinese companies to open in India, import a lot of Chinese inputs. It's very difficult for India to become a manufacturing superpower or to do a rapid green transition shift without Chinese inputs, Chinese know-how, Chinese battery technologies. But if you do that, then you become dependent on China in a way that the security people will think is very risky. And so you have this very difficult tension between economic development or climate mitigation policies on the one hand and long-term security on the other, given reasonable people could say that it's very unlikely that there's going to be some sort of grand rapprochement between India and China, and that their future is one of tension and competition because of all of the reasons that are pretty obvious. And so I think, India is trying to make this path. It would be very healthy for India to have a larger manufacturing share. There is an open opportunity, but, as you know, Akshobh, and anyone who's lived in India, including Ambassador Blake, knows it's a hard place to do business. So it's still a work in progress.
Indeed.
And of course, I should just add, if I could, that Trump is pressuring Apple to bring a lot of that iPhone manufacturing back to the United States as well. So that's sort of an additional complication for India.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that is fascinating about Apple iPhone manufacturing is most of your phones are either made in China or China. So it's a very interesting thing. And given that the Indian government has prioritized Make in India and the production-linked incentive scheme. So, Shihoko, as we, James sort of opened up the door on talking about critical emerging technology there. The talk about AI, semiconductors, biotechnology, cybersecurity. This got a lot of precedence in the previous administration with the Chips and Sciences Act under Secretary Gina Raimondo. One of course, the another threat that we speak about in the region is a little away from the South China Sea, but also the Taiwan Strait. Given Taiwan's location, it's sort of under the China security umbrella, in the sense there's a bit of a threat element of China. Sort of, we speak about comparison of Taiwan and Ukraine and China and Russia. I'm just curious right now. We saw President Biden come up with the Chips and Sciences Act. How is the Trump administration looking at Taiwan, both the economic security element with a national security lens, given Taiwan's dominance in the semiconductor space, TSMC?
Yeah, so absolutely, Taiwan dominates in the advanced chip manufacturing sector, and the world literally runs on Taiwanese-made chips. But if we look at the latest trade negotiation developments from Washington, Taiwan has actually not received a letter from the Trump administration yet, and but nevertheless, in April, the Trump administration proposed a 32% reciprocal tariff on Taiwan. The fact that there is no letter yet is seen by some in Taipei as the win, saying that this will allow Taiwan to have an upper hand in negotiating with the White House. I think that's wishful thinking on the part of the Taiwanese, but we'll see what that means. There are 3 points that I want to make when it comes to Taiwan's own economic vulnerability. So we talk on the one hand about Taiwan's domination of the advanced chip manufacturing sector. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind, firstly, that Taiwan depends heavily both on imports and exports. So 60% of its GDP comes from trade. And it's vulnerable as a result to tariffs for its exports to the United States, of course. But at the same time, it's also very vulnerable because it is so dependent on imports. So it only has about a surplus of about 2 months of natural gas, and its supply for crude is only for about 6 months, and that is also the case for food as well. And so when there is all this discussion and concern about a potential blockade of Taiwan, that blockade is going to really hurt Taiwan's domestic prospects as well. And then secondly, this whole idea of one company playing an outside role for the Taiwanese economy, with TSMC representing 15% of the Taiwanese GDP, is really not a sustainable model for growth. And when we talk about tariffs, ultimately we're talking about issues like supply chain resiliency, and these are not led by governments, they're led by private companies. And business development strategies are already being very vulnerable to the changing political winds in the United States. And Trump has repeatedly said that Taiwan stole the innovation of the US chip manufacturing sector. And it's also pushing for the return of chip manufacturing capabilities to the United States, just like we're talking about bringing back the manufacturing capability of Apple and other manufactured goods as well. In response, we've seen TSMC push up its commitment to build in the United States. Initially, it was $65 billion. It's committed another additional $100 billion to that to invest in Arizona. That's also changed TSMC's own investment prospects. There's speculation, rumors abound, that TSMC will not be investing in a second Japanese plant And because it really wants to focus on investing more in the United States because of those political headwinds. There's also speculation that it will invest less in Germany as well, even though investing more abroad outside of Taiwan, but hedging and investing more beyond the United States would actually ultimately be to the strength of TSMC itself. TSMC, I should point out, has denied these speculations, saying that it will not comment on market rumor, but I wanted to throw that out to talk about TSMC's own political vulnerabilities. And then thirdly, Trump has been very critical about Taiwan's defense expenditure, which currently is under 3% of Taiwan's GDP. And to be fair to Trump, both the Republicans and the Democrats have repeatedly said that Taiwan actually needs to do more, have more skin in the game to enhance its own defense capabilities. But one of the numbers that's being bandied about in the DoD at the moment is to the tune of 10%, which is a huge increase in the defense expenditure of Taiwan, and it would strain its economy at a time when it really does need to double down on boosting its own domestic economic resilience to disruptions.
Yeah, thanks, Shihoko. And, as you touch on TSMC, just want to use this chance to say a great book. Obviously, I think Chris Miller wrote the book on it, Chip War. Fortunate, to have studied under him. And James, I think you did a great interview or a series with him as well. So everyone who wants to understand critical minerals or TMC or chips or why we are in this AI, semiconductor race, have to read that book. It's a great book and sheds insights on this as well. And Ambassador Blake, I wanted to speak to you about a recent summit. We spoke about the Shangri-La summit, but of course the NATO summit that just wrapped up. President Trump, as he entered, sort of spoke about ramping up defense spending for NATO members, 5% of GDP by 2035. He's been very critical of this transatlantic relationship about NATO spending right from Trump 1.0. And Secretary Hegseth took some of this in Shangri-La when he said Asian partners need to emulate a handful of European nations and boost their spending to 5% of GDP. Fundamental difference between European nations and a lot of ASEAN nations is, of course, what OECD would talk about is their economic heft. Can ASEAN nations, that depend on the US security umbrella, as we speak about China's belligerence of South China Sea, can they afford to, spend up this kind of amount of GDP on defense spending, especially when a lot of them are still focusing on development back at home? Is this sort of a viable strategy in the long run?
Yeah, I don't think so. For the simple reason that these two regions are very, very different and face different security environments. As you rightly say, unlike the NATO countries, most of the ASEAN countries, with the exception of Singapore, are middle income or lower income countries. So they have to continue to prioritize efforts to increase growth rates, to eliminate poverty, to improve health and education, and increasingly deal with new financing requirements for decarbonization, climate adaptation, and disaster recovery, which is often crowding out a lot of these things. And then on top of that, you have, as you mentioned, the NATO countries, in order to meet this 5% target that Trump is pressing them to meet, they're going to have to reduce their own development budgets and development assistance budgets to ASEAN and elsewhere. So that, just introduces a new complication for many of these ASEAN countries. And then on the other side is the threat perception. With the possible exception of the Philippines and Vietnam and maybe Singapore and Malaysia, most of these countries do not see China as posing the same level of military threat that Russia does to many of the NATO countries. So they're going to be reluctant to increase their military budgets by as much as 5% to meet a threat that they just don't see as that serious. So for those reasons, I think we haven't really seen the administration try to press this objective with the same vigor in ASEAN, that it has with the NATO countries, and I don't think they will, because it's just it's going to be very difficult to get them to do that.
Yeah, James, I want to take the next question to you because, Ambassador Blake touched on ASEAN countries, Shihoko touched on Japan, you spoke about India. We'd be really remiss if we didn't speak about Australia, the fourth quad country here. Foreign Minister Penny Wong, recently gave an interview to the Washington Post, and he said there's sort of a concern on the larger outlook of AUKUS, sort of paraphrasing from that interview, really. The Quad is far from an Asian NATO. They've reminded us multiple times where every time there's such a gathering, but there was a trilateral between the UK, Australia, and the US known as AUKUS, where of course the US is about retrofitting nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. There's sort of a concern in some parts of corridor to Washington. There's an ongoing Pentagon review of the AUKUS. This pact, of course, was forged by the Biden administration 2-3 years ago, and it's headed detractors in Washington, perhaps even some in Canberra. And we speak about the Indo-Pacific. Is the AUKUS sort of adding more of the security element that the Quad doesn't overtly do? And two is, given you're in London, a very good vantage point, is this now bringing Britain more into the Indo-Pacific strategy? Because we saw French President Emmanuel Macron touch upon a European Indo-Pacific strategy, Shangri-La. What is Britain's Indo-Pacific strategy, given it's for the longest time been a transatlantic power?
So, I feel your listeners would be, you shouldn't be tangling up the Quad and AUKUS in their minds. As in, it's very tempting to do this because people like to talk about the rise of minilaterals, and the two most prominent minilaterals are the Quad and AUKUS, but they're really very different. And in a sense, the attitude of Australia is indicative, as in Australia has been, along with India to some degree, has been the country within the Quad that has been most resistant to making the Quad more hard security focused. I think maybe that might be a sort of changing a little bit now, partly because that's something that makes sense to the Trump administration and partly because China's behavior. But traditionally, Australia has been very wary. So the Quad is formally called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, but Australia in particular has been very wary of making it more security focused. They want it more focused on, being nice to people and public goods, and their strategic interest is using the Quad as a way to build relationships in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. And those countries don't like anything that even vaguely hints at an Asian NATO. So Australia has been very against that. Obviously, the AUKUS is totally different because AUKUS is, although it has a little bit of technological innovation tacked on at the side, is fundamentally a defense procurement program in which Australia decided that it needed nuclear-powered submarines. The challenge for AUKUS has been, there are many challenges for AUKUS. It's a big, complicated program that has all sorts of reasons why it might not work in the long run. But the main one at the moment is that the Trump administration has come in and realized that in delivering the SSN AUKUS submarines, or at least the Virginia-class submarines, which are going to precede the building of this new SSN AUKUS, which will actually be built by the Brits, that is sort of getting in the way of the Americans' ability to deliver their own submarines. And so at a moment in which the Pentagon is very worried about the military balance in Asia and China racing away, then the reason why the Pentagon, under the Defense Secretary, but driven by Bridge Colby, the sort of head of policy at the Pentagon, they've introduced this AUKUS review is, I think, to try and work out whether this is real and whether they can actually deliver these submarines without materially harming America's submarine production, but also as a way of gaining leverage over the Australians to try and force them to spend more on their own defense. One of the most remarkable things about Secretary Hegseth's Shangri-La Dialogue speech, for those of us sitting in Europe, was that Secretary Hegseth praised the Europeans for spending more on defense than the Asian allies and partners were doing. So, Hegseth was chiding Japan, Taiwan, Australia principally for not spending enough on defense and saying, look at Germany, they're really going for it, which is completely remarkable shift over the last 2 or 3 years. In terms of the Europeans, which is a wholly separate issue. So yes, the United Kingdom does have some strategic anchors in Asia. AUKUS is one. It's joining CPTPP. It has ASEAN observer status, has a fighter program it's developing with the Japanese. But I think, to be honest, there was a period 2 or 3 years ago where a lot of the big European powers were rolling out Indo-Pacific strategies, including the European Union itself in Brussels, and that was a new thing to show new engagement in the Pacific. I think the energy has slightly gone out of that, partly because the problems that Europe has at home on its eastern flank with the Russians are so severe, and the problems that it has with Washington are so severe that the US is in one form or another going to reduce its commitment to Europe and potentially could pull out altogether. We don't yet know. Therefore, all of the Europeans have to have a NATO Europe first approach, and therefore their commitment to the Indo-Pacific remains. I mean, I think it is important to say nobody's been pulling out. There's still a lot of engagement in both directions. You have Asian powers who are spending more time thinking about Europe, particularly Korea, Japan, Australia, and India. But you have European powers who are thinking more about Asia. But the sort of the notion that you would have got if you listened to Boris Johnson, our slightly lamentable previous prime minister, that you had this global Britain that was going to go off buccaneering and do lots of things in the Indo-Pacific, that hasn't lasted terribly well. I think you now have a more mature approach in which the larger European countries, Britain, France, Germany, now to some degree Poland, Ukraine, are engaged in the Indo-Pacific in the same way that the middle powers in Asia are engaged in Europe, but they're not, thinking that they're going to have any material effect on the balance of power because they've got plenty of problems in their own backyard.
Definitely, it's a good reminder of Boris Johnson's time at number 10. Of course, very different government there right now. The Labour Party is back in power. As we get to the business end of the webinar, I just want to remind our audience, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat box. We'll try to get to them as many as we can, to tap on Shihoko, James, and Bob's pearls of wisdom. Shihoko, I have this question for you, because one of the things I came across in the joint statement was sort of this overt mention of the threat of terror and terror groups. I mean, of course, India's external affairs minister spoke about the recent attack in Pahalgam, Kashmir, and the Quad members had a condemnation of it. Japan too had a concern about North Korea, and in the statement read, destabilizing launches of missiles and insist on complete denuclearization of the peninsula. It's a familiar foe for Washington, Pyongyang. It's been there for a long time. But not too long ago, we saw the historic meetings between President Trump and DPRK leader Kim in the first term. James will remember that, the meeting in Singapore at Sentosa, and of course, President Trump at the DMZ, unprecedentedly crossing over. He's made barbs about leader Kim, calling him Little Rocket Man, but he also has this sort of strongman diplomacy that he's spoken about with people like Putin in the past. How do you see Trump 2.0 address this threats in the Korean Peninsula, north of the 38th parallel? Do you think it's going to try and pursue this sort of personalized diplomacy that we saw in Trump 1.0, or is it just going to be, I'll deal with it when I deal with it?
Yeah, so you highlight the successful meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore, but that was actually followed up in 2019 with a second meeting in Vietnam, which actually ended abruptly. And in the world of diplomacy, everything is scripted out, but Trump walked out of the dinner, much to the devastation of Kim Jong-un, and it's been pretty dire since. Trump, in his second administration, he said that he's opened to talks with North Korea, but we have to bear in mind not only the needs and wants of the United States, but the fact that we are now in a very different geopolitical landscape, and there is probably even less incentive for North Korea to go into negotiations about denuclearization. And we see that change, especially in North Korea's relations with Russia. We see the North Korean commitment in Ukraine in particular, deploying its troops anywhere up to 30,000 troops to support Putin's war effort. And in return, North Korea is getting technology assistance from Russia. And it's also able to test its own military capabilities in a war zone in real time. But we've also seen a changing nature in relations between North Korea and South Korea. And this whole idea of reunification of the Korean Peninsula is no longer a goal for Pyongyang. And South Korea has now been labeled the so-called principal enemy of North Korea. So Trump may put, for instance, the Indo-Pacific as a priority, and he may want to go into negotiation or have discussions with Kim Jong-un. But the reality, as we've said a number of times over the course of this discussion, is that there are immediate concerns for the United States in dealing with the situation in the Middle East and the like. And there's real concern about US overstretch. But I think we should really bear in mind that there is no clarity about what the US goal vis-a-vis North Korea is under this current Trump administration. And if there is no clear stated goal, there is no guarantee in a breakthrough. So if that's the case, then the overtures for negotiations are not motivated.
Indeed. I mean, it remains to be seen what happens from now on the Korean Peninsula, and given there's obviously the concern that Japan has as well as another American ally in South Korea. I'm going to just get as we get to the business end of the webinar, Ambassador Blake, touch on another important element of the Quad. The education remains a core focus, particularly STEM education. We talked about the Quad STEM fellowships. And the recent statement said that the goal is to build the next generation of science and technology leaders, par for the course, given the focus on AI, semiconductors, chips. I'm curious right now, given that the next cohort of Quad fellows are going to be based in Japan, India has launched a Quad STEM fellowship. This touches on to a larger element of soft power codified by Joe Nye, bless his soul, wherever it is. The US has sort of the preeminent technical and research institutes. And given there's sort of been this delay, Ambassador Blake, as with student visas and scholar visas coming in, the long-term goal is a lot of these universities did produce the best and brightest for American corporations and American foreign service that, are we missing the forest for the trees, by delaying sort of the supply chain of talent in the US, that the US may not be able to do the China plus one, to try to compete with China on the AI race, the semiconductor race, by not having these universities have these high skilled talent, are we sort of missing the forest for the trees?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I am very much concerned that we're losing not only our competitive edge, but potentially, our soft power and influence around the world. And it's not just because of more restrictive student visa policies, but as you say, substantial cuts to scientific research. For those listeners around the world who may not be following it this closely, in May, the administration cut off my alma mater, Harvard University's ability to admit international students. A court has blocked that decision for the moment, so that remains in the court. But more broadly, what you're seeing under the guise of eliminating anti-Semitism and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on campus, many people think that the real motivation for the administration is to undo what they see as the nurturing of progressive ideas on these university campuses. And, there's real concern now that these campaigns against Harvard and other universities are going to impact the key research that really drives America's innovation and competitiveness. And that these policies are going to drive many of those researchers to other countries. I used to, when I was ambassador, I used to like to remind people that researchers in the United States have won more Nobel Prizes in the hard sciences than any other country. And many of those winners were born in other countries, but then chose to pursue their research in the United States. And that is now at risk. And then beyond that, our ability to attract foreign students not only earns us about $40 billion a year in foreign exchange, but it's really a core part of our soft power. Students who come to the United States to study leave with a respect and an affection for our country, despite all of our warts and faults. And again, I think that, if we start to put that at risk, it's going to be a shame. And so we're seeing, for example, that the State Department has put out guidance to all of our consular officers who are adjudicating student visas, that for the first time, they're going to have to scrutinize social media posts for anti-American or anti-Semitic postings. Those kind of things are going to have a real deterrent effect on applications. And again, I worry it's going to have a much wider long-term impact on our competitiveness and on our ability to innovate.
Yeah, absolutely. A Quad is about soft power, and irrespective of China's economic power, there's America's always had the soft power component. And there's no surprise that Silicon Valley feeds into Stanford, Stanford feeds into Silicon Valley, as do biotech bubbles around Boston with Harvard and MIT. I wanted to ask you this, James. There's a lot of progress made on the Quad working level group, from climate, critical emerging tech, health, cyber, infrastructure. It's hard to crystal ball gaze, but I'm going to make you wear your soothsayer hat. The Quad leaders meeting likely to be in November. How do you see any progress and outcome at the principal level? We have a Quad Ports of Future partnership happening in Mumbai around October 2025 that could serve a precursor. But this will also be President Trump's first visit in his second term. He did go to India in February, I think, before the world shut down in this first term. What do you anticipate for the Quad Leaders Summit? There's a lot of time between now and November, but that's why I'm giving you the tough question to play soothsayer.
Well, I think let's look at the NATO summit as an example. And so you had this very difficult conundrum that the NATO leaders had in terms of how you engage with Trump. As in, he doesn't like long meetings. He doesn't like lots of fiddly detail. He likes good optics. So, I think probably there'll be some lessons learned from that. You have this big tension, I think, at the heart of the Quad, which is, yes, there's all sorts of initiatives that you can do. There's been a proliferation of initiatives on nice public good agendas like disaster relief or infrastructure or vaccines. And sort of fundamentally, Trump doesn't care about any of this stuff. And therefore, sort of getting the cadence of the meeting right and trying to manage, in a sense, what will look good for the US out of this. I think that will be the thing that's on the mind of the leaders, and to what extent they need to toughen up the Quad because of the perception that really what the Americans are interested in is something that's more security focused, and whether or not India on the one hand and Australia on the other are going to have a problem with that. Japan traditionally, I think, has been more comfortable with using the Quad as a counterweight to China, although, as Shihoko said, Japan has its own domestic issues and issues with the US as well. So I think lots of complexity there. To be absolutely honest, I think probably the main energy around the Quad summit is simply going to be in the India-US bilateral, as in that will be what the Indians really care about, and that will be what the Americans care about as well, which is making sure that the US-India component of this goes well. That may be to the Quad's advantage in the sense that most of the focus will not be on the Quad, it will be on Trump being in India with Modi and the inevitable bromance headlines that will follow from that, and the hope on the Indian side that the combination of the trade war and Trump messing around with India, Pakistan, and all the other things have not derailed the very successful story of the US-India bilateral, which has been on a strong upward trajectory for nearly 2 decades, but particularly the last 5 years. And there'll be hope on both sides that the sort of little road bumps that it has hit, some quite big road bumps in terms of tariffs, bilateral trade, and the India-Pakistan stuff will be in the rearview mirror by then, and they can get back to talking about building the areas of this bilateral relationship that makes sense to both of them, namely defense and technology investment and that kind of thing.
Yeah, indeed. There's a lot to happen right now from the February meeting that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump had, US-India Compact, US-India Trust. So a lot more to follow up on that. And as you rightly said, James, the bilateral meeting is sort of what's going to keep a lot of us US-India watchers glued to. Shihoko, one of the interesting points is, and as we get an audience question, we can tie that in as well. Despite common ground in China, Canberra, Tokyo, New Delhi, and Washington all have their umbrage with Beijing. But Quad members have sort of had differed on certain hotspot issues. One, of course, the current statement didn't mention Ukraine, didn't mention Iran, sort of geopolitical hotspots. President Trump has, of course, been very brazenly critical of BRICS. The recent summit also took place in Brazil, where he thinks that there's sort of a de-dollarization impact happening. India is an integral member of BRICS. In fact, was one of the founding members as well, the I in BRICS, that stands for it. And India's foreign policy's got strategic non-alignment and decade-long relationship. This hasn't stopped any momentum of the Quad. I'm just curious, Shihoko, wearing a larger Indo-Pacific hat, given, as you said, Japan has its own internal consideration, all countries do. Do you think that as competing interests sort of take place, will it irk the Trump administration more so than its predecessor? Because we got the feeling from the Biden administration, even on CATSA, that, okay, every country has its own sort of perspective. Let's not lose sight of the larger picture of Indo-Pacific. Do you feel that anything competing in this occasion may irk the Trump administration more so vis-a-vis the Quad?
Yeah, so one of the biggest questions, of course, is about to what extent the United States is committed to providing public goods. And it has been a leader in that since the end of World War II, it has played the central role in ensuring the lifting of all boats. And that spans across the world, not just in Asia, but also in Europe. And so the Trump administration's argument is that leveling has been achieved, and so the administration needs to now look forward to ensure U.S. interests moving forward. Before I kind of complete that thought, I want to go back to what Ambassador Blake was talking about and soft power of the United States in the context of what we look for from the United States. I remember a Japanese physicist who won a Nobel Prize a few years ago. And of course, the Japanese media was very excited and saying, oh my goodness, it's a Japanese national who won this prize. But the physicist said in interviews, multiple interviews, and said, I owe nothing to Japan. I am now a US citizen. I might have been born in Japan, but any success that I have been able to achieve is because it was what the opportunities the US university and the US system provided me. And if I had stayed in Japan, I would have not been able to be what I am. So that was a bit of a downer for the Japanese media. But right now, the sentiment is, there's a great deal of concern and anxiety about the United States. And we've talked a great deal about decoupling or de-risking from China. The conversation has moved now in many parts of the world, including Japan, about not necessarily decoupling. No one can decouple from the United States, but de-risking from the United States, and to what extent and what that may look like and what kind of partnerships that may include. And we have to bear in mind that there is also no consensus regarding what the China challenge is. When you go to South and Southeast Asia, as we all know, saying that China is a threat warrants immediate pushback. And the concept of using this phrase about an Indo-Pacific is seen as shorthand for containment of China, which makes many countries in the region very uncomfortable. So the question is whether this idea of de-risking both from the United States as well as from China, and we know that many countries are concerned about Chinese economic coercion, the trends for it to export excess capacity and the like. These are challenges, but at the same time, coercive efforts on the part of the United States, and we see that in the trade policies that the United States is currently trying to pursue. These are areas which could potentially lead to greater collective economic security, either with or without the United States.
Apologies. Thanks so much, Shihoko. Just on a final note, one last audience question coming in and opening up to whoever wants to take this. It says, from Beijing's perspective, arming Tehran, is it a viable Chinese strategy to force the US away from the Indo-Pacific? Something I haven't considered, or I don't know if many people have, but whoever wants to take that, that's a very interesting question.
Sorry, just say, Akshobh, is it a viable strategy to push the United States out of the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, this is a question from our audience saying, from Beijing's perspective, is sort of creating tensions in the Middle East a viable strategy to distract the US from its Indo-Pacific focus?
Oh, I see. So the sort of the notion is China deliberately monkeying around in the Middle East? I mean, I don't really think that's what China's doing, to be honest. China seeks stability in most regions. I mean, one can be very critical of China in different respects, but when China thinks of the Middle East, it thinks about a security of energy supplies. And so I think that you would have to be very devious to think that China is deliberately fomenting trouble in the Middle East in order to kind of keep America bogged down. I think it's a very happy side effect for Beijing if America is indeed bogged down in the Middle East, and the sight of aircraft carriers shifting out of the Indo-Pacific and going to CENTCOM in the Middle East is welcome. But I don't think China acts in that way. I don't think China has the risk tolerance to do that. And I think it's a sort of sign sometimes of Western conspiracy theories that they see the hand of the Chinese in all of these things. Generally speaking, Beijing has been quite risk averse. I mean, it looks not just at the chaos in the Middle East or in Ukraine, and it sees chaos. It doesn't like chaos. It likes stability and predictability, and a world in which China is rising and the West is declining, and therefore abrupt crises that threaten trade routes and energy security tend to be something that Beijing's instinct is that it doesn't like. So I don't think that's in a sense an avenue that China will be pursuing, although it will be seeking, generally to weaken America's relationships in the Middle East and to build stronger ones for China. I'm not saying that China is inert. I do think that people overestimate the role that China plays in the Middle East. Actually, what's been notable in this crisis and in other crises is the very limited role that China plays. You see, for instance, things like the Saudi-Iran deal, which had China's blessing, but was really negotiated by others. Actually, the thing that's notable about China's role in the current set of crises is it hasn't really had much of a role. And why would you want to? If you're sitting in Beijing, why do you want to be part of this enormous mess? The Americans broke it, let them fix it.
Indeed. Well, we'll have to see how that plays out for the rest of the year coming forward. But this has been another interesting edition. Ambassador Bob Blake, James Crabtree, Shihoko Goto, thank you so much for the time. As promised, we are at the hour mark and we are at the witching hour, so we'll have to end it here. But thank you guys so much. Thank you for all our audience tuning in. These questions and conversations will be on our YouTube channel later on, so please do revisit that. And until another episode, where we'll have James, Ambassador Blake, and Shihoko again. Until then, it's goodbye for now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.